In the eyes of everyone who worked in the Ashton Tower, Daniel Carter was invisible. He wore the same gray jacket every day, carried a battered toolbox that had belonged to his father, and spoke only when spoken to. Nobody in that glass building knew his name unless they needed a leaking pipe fixed or a flickering light replaced. He was simply the maintenance man, the quiet figure in the service elevator, the shadow nobody bothered to look at twice. But 3 days before the storm that would change everything, a woman named Emily Ashton looked at him and laughed. And that single moment of cruelty set in motion a chain of events that neither of them could have predicted. Emily was 34 years old, the sole heiress to one of the largest real estate empires on the East Coast, a woman whose face appeared on business magazines, and whose name opened every door in the city without her ever having to knock. She had grown up believing that money was not just power, but proof of worth, and that people who remained poor simply had not tried hard enough. Her beauty was sharp and polished, her voice always confident, her opinions delivered like verdicts rather than suggestions. She had never once doubted that the world owed her comfort, because, in her experience, it always had. She had inherited the company from her father 2 years earlier, and in that time she had built a reputation as brilliant, relentless, and entirely unsentimental, a woman who could close a 9-figure deal before lunch and never once think to ask the name of the man who cleaned her office afterward. Daniel Carter was 38, a single father whose wife had died 4 years earlier, and a man who now lived a life so quiet that most people mistook his silence for emptiness. He drove a pickup truck older than some of the employees in the building he serviced, its paint chipped and its engine coughing every morning like an old friend clearing his throat. He rented a small apartment above a laundromat 2 bus stops from downtown, and every dollar he did not need for rent or food, he sent across the country to the grandparents raising his child in his absence, a sacrifice he never spoke of and never regretted. He was, by every visible measure, a man with nothing, and yet something about the way he moved through the world, patient and unbothered, made the people who actually paid attention to him treat him with quiet respect. He rarely smiled, but when he did, it reached his eyes in a way that seemed to disarm even the coldest strangers. That afternoon, Daniel had been called up to the executive floor to repair a faulty circuit behind one of the marble walls, kneeling on the polished floor with wires in his hands when Emily walked past on her way to a meeting. She paused, taking in the frayed cuffs of his jacket and the dust on his knees, and turned to the assistant beside her with a small, cold smile. "Some people were simply born to stay poor," she said, loudly enough for Daniel to hear every word. The assistant laughed nervously. Daniel did not look up from his work. He did not argue, did not flinch, did not even seem to register that he had been insulted, and that composure, more than anything, was what made Emily's smile falter for just a fraction of a second before she walked on, already forgetting him. But Daniel did not forget. He simply chose, as he always chose, not to let another person's cruelty become his own burden to carry. He had learned, in the years since Sarah's death, that dignity was not something other people could take from him unless he agreed to hand it over. And he was not in the habit of handing anything over easily. The days that followed only deepened the divide between their two worlds. Emily crossed paths with Daniel more often than either of them expected. In the elevator on rainy mornings, in the parking garage where his old truck sat awkwardly beside rows of gleaming imported cars, in the marble lobby where he mopped up puddles tracked in by hurried tenants. Each time, Emily's expression carried the same flicker of distaste, as though his presence were a stain on an otherwise spotless building. Her friends, when they visited, picked up on her tone immediately and mirrored it, murmuring behind manicured hands whenever Daniel passed, treating him less like a person and more like part of the furniture that occasionally needed adjusting. One woman in Emily's circle even joked that the building should install a separate elevator for staff, and Emily laughed along without a second thought, unaware of how small that laughter made her look to the people who overheard it. One cold morning, Emily arrived at the parking garage in a temper, having just lost a negotiation she was certain she deserved to win, and found Daniel's rusted pickup truck parked directly beside her imported sports car. She did not ask him to move it. She turned instead to the security guard trailing behind her and snapped, "Move that junk before I have it towed." The words landed in the concrete stillness of the garage like a slap, and several employees nearby lowered their eyes, embarrassed on Daniel's behalf, even though he was not. Daniel walked over without a word, started the engine, and pulled the truck into another spot 2 rows away. He did not glare at her. He did not mutter under his breath the way most people would have. He simply moved the truck, glanced briefly at Emily, with an expression that held no anger at all, only a strange and quiet pity, and went back to his work as though nothing had happened. It was that pity, more than any anger could have, that unsettled Emily for the rest of the day, though she would not have admitted it to anyone, and she found herself, somewhat to her own irritation, still thinking about it hours later during a meeting that had nothing to do with him at all. Among the building's staff, however, a different story was quietly taking shape. The security guards greeted Daniel by name and offered him coffee on cold mornings. The elderly woman who ran the flower stand outside always saved him the wilting bouquets for free, knowing he liked to bring color into his otherwise gray apartment. A young janitor who had once been homeless told anyone who would listen that Daniel had paid for his bus pass every week for 2 months without ever mentioning it again. A widow on the 4th floor swore that Daniel had once climbed 3 flights of stairs during a power outage just to check on her because he remembered she used a walker and might be frightened in the dark. Slowly, a picture began to form among those who actually paid attention, a picture entirely at odds with the version of Daniel that Emily and her friends found so easy to mock. It was not long before pieces of Daniel's past began surfacing, not through gossip, but through small, accidental revelations that those around him stumbled upon. A retired firefighter who had come to inspect the building's sprinkler system recognized Daniel instantly and called out to him with genuine warmth, addressing him as though greeting an old brother, and in that brief exchange, witnesses learned that Daniel had once been one of the most decorated firefighters in the state, a man who had run into burning buildings without hesitation, who had pulled children and grandmothers alike from the jaws of collapsing structures. He had walked away from that life after his wife's death, unable to bear the thought of risking everything for strangers, while his own child waited at home without a mother, and he had chosen instead a life so ordinary it made no headlines and asked for no medals. Since then, Daniel had drifted through a string of quiet jobs, always taking whatever paid enough to keep his son cared for 2,000 miles away, living with grandparents, while Daniel worked to send money north every single month. He ate simply, dressed plainly, and denied himself almost everything that might have been considered a comfort, not because he did not deserve rest, but because rest, to him, felt like a luxury that belonged to someone else's life. Those who worked beside him sensed a stillness in him that they could not quite explain, a peace that seemed to come from a man who had already lost the thing he feared losing most, and had decided that nothing else could frighten him after that. He called his son every Sunday evening without fail, and coworkers said his voice changed entirely during those calls. Lighter, warmer, full of a joy he seemed to save specifically for that 1 hour of the week. One gray afternoon, an elderly woman collapsed on the sidewalk outside the Ashton Tower, her grocery bags scattering across the wet pavement as passers-by stepped around her, phones raised more often than hands offered. Daniel was crossing the street at that exact moment, and without a second's hesitation, he dropped his toolbox and rushed to her side, checking her breathing, elevating her legs, calling for an ambulance in a voice that was calm enough to keep the gathering crowd from panicking. He stayed with her until the paramedics arrived, holding her hand the entire time, and then quietly picked up his toolbox and walked away before anyone thought to ask his name. Emily happened to be watching from her office window above, her phone pressed to her ear mid-conversation, and something about the sight made her pause. She recognized the gray jacket immediately. For a moment, she felt something close to admiration, quickly followed by the familiar dismissal she had trained herself to reach for. It was probably nothing, she told herself. Just a coincidence. Just a man doing what anyone should have done, and she returned to her call without giving it another thought, unaware that this brief flicker of respect was the first small crack in a wall she had spent her whole life building. That crack, however, would not stay small for long, because within days, Emily would be forced to see Daniel in a way she never expected. And the storm that was coming would leave no room left for pride. There was one more encounter before the gala, small and easily overlooked, that later took on far greater weight in Emily's memory. She had stayed late one evening finishing a contract review, and by the time she left, the building was nearly empty, the halls dim and quiet, except for the hum of the elevators. Daniel was still there too, checking a faulty fire alarm panel on her floor. And for a brief moment the two of them stood alone in the corridor, with no assistants, no board members, and no audience to perform for. Emily, unsettled by the silence, asked him without thinking why he never seemed angry no matter how badly people treated him. Daniel considered the question seriously, the way he considered most things, and told her that anger was a debt he could not afford to keep paying, that he had already lost more than most people ever would, and that he refused to let bitterness take anything else from him. Emily had no response for that. She simply nodded and walked to the elevator. And the conversation lingered in her mind far longer than she expected it to, an unwelcome seed of doubt about everything she thought she understood. The turning point began at a gala Emily herself had organized, a glittering charity event held in the grand ballroom of the Ashton Tower to raise funds for underprivileged families across the city, an irony that would not become clear to her until much later. Daniel had been assigned to handle the technical setup for the evening, adjusting lighting rigs and testing sound equipment long before the first guest arrived, moving unnoticed among caterers and event staff who barely glanced his way. Emily arrived in a shimmering emerald gown, greeting donors with practiced warmth, entirely unaware that the night was about to expose something in her she had never had to confront before. Crystal chandeliers threw soft gold light across the ballroom. A string quartet played somewhere near the far wall. And for a while, the evening unfolded exactly as Emily had planned it, flawless and controlled. Midway through the evening, a clumsy guest carrying 2 glasses of red wine stumbled near Emily, sending the dark liquid splashing across the front of her dress in a spreading stain that drew gasps from the crowd around her. In the chaos of the moment, someone pointed toward Daniel, who happened to be standing nearby adjusting a cable, and before anyone could clarify what had actually happened, Emily turned on him with fury blazing in her eyes, accusing him loudly of ruining her dress and embarrassing her in front of the very donors she had spent months courting. The ballroom fell into an uncomfortable hush as her voice rose, sharp and unforgiving, cutting through the music. Daniel could have corrected her easily. He could have pointed to the true culprit, a red-faced businessman already slinking away into the crowd, and let the humiliation fall where it belonged. Instead, he simply lowered his head and said, quietly, that he was sorry, absorbing the blame that was never his to carry, because he understood in an instant that correcting her in front of her guests would only deepen her embarrassment, and some part of him could not bring himself to add to another person's pain, even when that person had shown him none. Security escorted him out of the ballroom minutes later. And as he walked past rows of guests in tailored suits and diamond earrings, he felt the full weight of their contempt pressing down on him, silent and suffocating. He did not argue on his way out. He did not look back. He simply walked into the cold night air with the same steady composure he always carried, leaving behind a room full of people who believed they had just witnessed a poor man's clumsiness rather than an act of quiet, undeserved grace. One young caterer who had seen the entire exchange from across the room quietly told a coworker afterward that she had never respected anyone as much as she respected the man who had just been thrown out for a mistake that was not his own. The storm that had been threatening all evening finally broke just after midnight, rain hammering the streets in relentless sheets as Emily left the gala alone, still simmering with irritation over her ruined dress and the scene she had caused. She waved off her driver, insisting on taking her own car, needing the silence of the road to cool her temper, unaware that fate had already set its course for the night ahead. The highway leading toward her penthouse was slick and nearly empty, streetlights blurring behind curtains of rain, and Emily gripped the wheel a little tighter than usual as thunder rolled somewhere in the distance, her thoughts still tangled in the humiliation of the evening rather than the road ahead of her. A delivery truck, 2 lanes over, lost control on the flooded asphalt. its tires hydroplaning across the slick surface, and in the space of a single terrifying second, it clipped the side of Emily's car, sending it spinning off the road and down a shallow embankment where it came to rest against a tree with a sickening crunch of metal. Emily's head struck the steering wheel, and for a moment, everything went dark before pain dragged her back to consciousness. The world tilted and screaming with the hiss of a fractured engine somewhere beneath her. Smoke curled from beneath the crumpled hood, and beneath that smoke, the unmistakable scent of gasoline began to spread through the wreckage. No other cars stopped. A few slowed, their headlights briefly illuminating the wreck before speeding away. Drivers unwilling to risk their own safety on a night so violent, and Emily, trapped by a door that would not budge, and a seatbelt jammed tight against her ribs, began to understand with rising terror that she might die alone on the side of a road while the city rushed past without noticing. She screamed until her voice cracked, but the rain swallowed every sound, and for the first time in her adult life, Emily Ashton felt entirely, terrifyingly powerless. Every dollar she owned suddenly meaningless against the simple fact of fire and metal, and a door that would not open. It was Daniel, driving home from the gala in his old pickup truck, who saw the flicker of hazard lights through the storm and the faint orange glow beginning to bloom beneath the crumpled hood of a car half buried in the embankment. He recognized the vehicle instantly. He had seen it parked in that same garage 100 times, had moved his own truck out of its way more than once, and even through the chaos of the storm, some instinct told him exactly whose life was in danger inside that wreckage. He did not hesitate. He pulled over, threw open his door, and ran straight into the rain toward the burning car. His heart pounding louder than the thunder above him, every instinct he had spent years suppressing, suddenly roaring back to life at once. The heat radiating from the engine told him he had only seconds before the fire reached the fuel line, and he wasted none of them on caution. He wrenched at the driver's door with his bare hands, feeling the metal bite into his palms. And when it refused to give, he grabbed a tire iron from his truck bed and shattered the window in one violent swing, glass raining down around him as he reached through the broken frame to unlock the door from inside. Emily's eyes fluttered open, glassy with shock and pain, and for a single suspended moment, she looked up and saw the face of the man she had mocked just days before, now the only thing standing between her and the fire licking up from beneath the hood. He pulled at her, but her leg was pinned beneath a twisted section of the dashboard, and the flames were climbing higher now, curling around the edges of the hood with a hungry orange light that reflected in the flooded street. Daniel forced himself back inside the wreckage, ignoring the searing heat against his skin, and wrenched at the crushed metal with everything he had, feeling his shoulder scream in protest as he finally freed her leg from its trap. He hauled her out, just as the flames found the interior, dragging her clear across the wet grass with seconds to spare, and the two of them tumbled down the embankment together as the entire car erupted into a fireball behind them, the explosion lighting up the night sky and throwing heat across their backs even from a distance. Daniel shielded her body with his own, as debris rained down around them. And when the fire finally settled into a steady, roaring burn, he lay there for a moment in the mud and the rain, blood running from a gash along his forearm where the glass had cut deep, his shoulder throbbing from the effort of tearing metal apart with his hands. Emily lay beside him, unconscious from the shock and the blow to her head, her emerald gown soaked and torn, entirely unaware that the man she had once dismissed as beneath her notice had just risked everything to save the very life she had never once thought to value in anyone but herself. Sirens finally cut through the storm minutes later, and as paramedics rushed toward them, Daniel's last conscious thought before the world faded to black was simply that he hoped she would be all right. Emily woke 2 days later to the steady beeping of hospital monitors and the sterile white glow of fluorescent lights, her head wrapped in bandages and her leg elevated in a brace, disoriented and unsure at first whether the crash had been real or some fevered nightmare conjured by pain medication. A nurse gently explained what had happened: the crash, the fire, and the man who had pulled her from the wreckage before the explosion could take her with it. And when Emily asked who that man was, the answer landed on her like a second collision entirely. It was Daniel, the maintenance man she had ridiculed in front of her friends. The man whose truck she had ordered removed like garbage. The man she had blamed for a stain on her dress that was never his fault at all. Emily lay in stunned silence as the nurse continued, mentioning almost as an afterthought that Daniel himself had been treated for lacerations and a dislocated shoulder in the same hospital, and that despite his injuries, he had insisted on donating blood that same night when the hospital ran low during a series of emergencies, giving of himself even while wounded. Simply because he could. For a long while, Emily simply lay in the hospital bed staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment the flames had risen around the wreckage and the certainty that had gripped her that she would not survive the night. She remembered the exact sound the window made when it shattered, the cold rain mixing with the heat of the fire, and the strange calm in Daniel's eyes even as he tore at the metal with his bare hands. It struck her, lying there in the sterile quiet, that a man she had treated as beneath her attention had looked at her burning car and seen only a life worth saving, nothing else. No memory of her cruelty, no hesitation born of resentment, only the plain fact that a person was in danger and he was capable of helping. Something inside Emily cracked open at that moment, a slow and uncomfortable unraveling of every assumption she had built her identity around. She spent the following days making quiet inquiries, first out of guilt, then out of genuine curiosity, and what she discovered painted a portrait of a man entirely unlike the caricature she had constructed in her mind. Co-workers described years of small, unspoken kindnesses, covered shifts, quietly paid utility bills for struggling families, food left anonymously outside the doors of people going through hard times. Nobody described these acts as extraordinary because Daniel had never once treated them that way, and that, more than anything, humbled Emily beyond words. She learned, too, that Daniel had once carried a woman down 6 flights of stairs during a fire drill gone wrong years earlier, an act nobody at the company even knew about until a former tenant mentioned it in passing. She thought of the many times she had looked at him and seen nothing but a worn jacket and a rusted truck, entirely blind to the depth of character standing quietly in front of her. She thought of her own life, filled with wealth and admiration, that had never once required her to sacrifice anything for anyone. And for the first time in her 34 years, Emily Ashton felt the sting of genuine shame, sharp and undeniable, settling into her chest like a stone she could not set down. As soon as the doctors allowed her to leave the hospital, Emily sought Daniel out, finding him recovering in a modest room down the hall, his arm in a sling and a row of stitches along his forearm, his expression as calm and unassuming as it had always been. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, unsure how to begin, before finally stepping forward and offering the words she had never once, in her entire adult life, felt the need to say to anyone beneath her. She told him she was sorry, not just for the accident, but for every cruel word, every dismissive glance, every moment she had made him feel small, simply because his circumstances differed from her own. Daniel listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he offered her a small, tired smile, the same quiet composure he always carried, and told her simply that everyone deserved a second chance, that people were often shaped by pain they never chose, and that he held no grudge against her at all. His forgiveness came so easily, so without condition, that it unsettled Emily more than anger ever could have, because she realized in that moment that grace like his was not something money could ever purchase. No matter how much of it she had, Emily tried, in the days that followed, to repay him in the only language she had ever truly understood, offering him money, a promotion, an apartment far nicer than the one above the laundromat, anything to settle what felt like an impossible debt. Daniel refused every offer with the same gentle firmness, explaining that he had not saved her life expecting anything in return, and that what he wanted, if he wanted anything at all, was simply to be seen as a person rather than a problem to be solved with a check. His words struck her harder than any lecture could have, because she understood, perhaps for the first time, that she had spent her whole life mistaking generosity for superiority, believing that writing checks was the same as caring. That realization began to reshape the way Emily moved through her own company, and in the weeks that followed her recovery, those around her noticed a change too significant to ignore. She began greeting security guards by name, instead of walking past them. She started asking maintenance staff how their families were doing, listening when they answered instead of simply nodding along. She quietly increased wages for the lowest-paid employees in the building, framing it not as charity, but as basic fairness. And when questioned by board members who worried about profit margins, she reminded them, with a conviction she had never carried before, that a company was only as strong as the people it too often overlooked. She personally reviewed every service contract in the building and discovered dozens of workers, like Daniel, who had been paid far less than the value of what they gave every single day. The distance she had once maintained so effortlessly between herself and people like Daniel began to close, not because she felt sorry for anyone, but because she had finally understood that the divide had never made sense to begin with. As the weeks passed, Emily found herself seeking out Daniel's company more often than strict necessity required, first under the guise of following up on his recovery, then simply because she wanted to. They began meeting for coffee at a small shop near the tower, an unremarkable place with mismatched chairs and a chalkboard menu, where nobody recognized the heiress sitting across from the quiet man in the worn jacket, and where, for the first time in years, Emily felt like she was simply talking to another human being rather than performing for an audience. She found herself laughing more easily in those small conversations than she had at any gala she could remember. They walked together through the park as autumn deepened into winter, the trees shedding their last gold and crimson leaves onto damp pathways. And in these unhurried conversations, Emily learned pieces of Daniel's life he had never shared with anyone at work. She learned about his wife, a school teacher named Sarah, who had died of a sudden illness 4 years earlier, leaving behind a grief so heavy that Daniel had walked away from the career he loved, simply because he could no longer bear the thought of risking his life for strangers, while his own child waited at home without a mother. She noticed, during one of these walks, a plain gold band still resting on his finger, and gently asked him about it. Daniel looked down at the ring for a long moment before answering, explaining quietly that he did not wear it because he was unable to move on, but because it reminded him of the best years of his life, a gratitude that outlasted the grief, and a promise he had made to himself to raise his son with the same kindness Sarah had shown everyone she ever met. Emily found herself deeply moved by the simplicity of his devotion. A devotion that asked for nothing, sought no attention, and existed purely because it was true. In a world where she had grown used to grand gestures performed for applause, Daniel's quiet loyalty felt like something rare enough to be almost foreign. And she found herself wondering, quietly, whether anyone had ever loved her that simply. Slowly, without either of them naming it, something began to shift between them. Daniel found himself opening up in ways he had not allowed himself since Sarah's death, sharing small jokes, admitting fears he had never spoken aloud, allowing himself, cautiously, to imagine a future that included someone else. Emily, in turn, learned humility in a way no business failure had ever taught her, discovering that listening could be more valuable than speaking, and that vulnerability, far from being a weakness, was often the most honest form of strength a person could offer another. Neither of them rushed what was growing between them. There were no dramatic declarations, no sweeping gestures meant to prove devotion, only the steady accumulation of small moments, a shared laugh over burnt coffee, a comfortable silence during a long walk, a level of trust neither had expected to find again. Daniel told her, one evening as the streetlights flickered on around them, that he had almost declined her first invitation to coffee, certain that whatever she felt was guilt rather than genuine interest, and that it had taken him weeks to believe she truly wanted to know him rather than simply repair her own conscience. Emily admitted, in return, that she had almost given up after that first hesitant conversation, assuming he would never fully trust her again after everything she had put him through, and that his willingness to try anyway had taught her more about forgiveness than any sermon ever could. She told him, too, that she had started noticing people she had never noticed before, the woman who swept the lobby every morning, the driver who waited patiently outside in the cold, the quiet workers who kept the entire building running while remaining almost entirely unseen, and that once she had learned to truly see one person clearly, she found she could no longer look past anyone the same way again. One evening, as they sat together on a bench overlooking the frozen edge of the park pond. Daniel spoke for the first time about his son with real detail, describing a boy who loved building things out of scrap wood just as his father once had, and who asked every single Sunday call when Daniel might finally visit again, now that the promotion had made travel easier. Emily listened without interrupting. And when he finished, she gently asked if she might one day be allowed to meet him, not to replace anything, but simply to know the parts of Daniel's life that mattered most. Daniel looked at her for a long moment, something soft and unguarded passing over his face, and told her that he thought his son would like her very much, especially once he learned that she, too, had once been taught an important lesson the hard way. There was an afternoon, not long before the first snow, when Emily invited Daniel to a small gathering at her home. Nothing like the galas she once threw, just a quiet dinner with a handful of people she actually trusted. He arrived in the same gray jacket he always wore, and rather than feeling embarrassed by it in front of her more polished guests, Emily found herself proud to introduce him, proud in a way that had nothing to do with impressing anyone and everything to do with simply wanting people to know him. One of her old friends, the same woman who had once joked about a separate elevator for staff, watched Daniel help clear the table without being asked, and later admitted quietly to Emily that she finally understood what had changed. Emily only smiled and said that some people had always been rich. They had simply been waiting for the rest of the world to notice. By the time winter fully settled over the city, frosting the park benches and turning their breath to fog in the cold morning air, both Daniel and Emily understood, without needing to say it aloud, that something meaningful had taken root between them, patient and unforced. Built not on spectacle but on the simple truth of who they each were when nobody else was watching. A year passed, and the transformation within the Ashton Company had become impossible for anyone to overlook. Emily had grown into a CEO respected not merely for her business acumen, which had always been considerable, but for a warmth and fairness that employees genuinely valued, the kind of leadership that inspired loyalty rather than fear. Daniel, meanwhile, had been formally appointed Director of Safety and Operations for the entire company, a position earned entirely through his own expertise and his years of quiet, disciplined experience. A role that finally allowed his skills to be recognized rather than hidden beneath a maintenance uniform. Nobody who worked there any longer saw him as invisible, and younger employees had even begun asking him for advice, treating him with the kind of respect once reserved only for executives on the top floor. To mark the anniversary of the accident that had changed both their lives so profoundly, Emily organized a company-wide appreciation ceremony, gathering every employee, from executives to janitorial staff, into the same grand ballroom where the gala had taken place 1 year earlier. Standing before the crowd in a simple dress, far less extravagant than the emerald gown she had worn that stormy night, Emily spoke without notes, her voice steady despite the emotion threading through it, recounting for everyone present the story of the man she had once mocked and the storm that had taught her the true weight of character. She told them plainly that she had once believed wealth was the measure of a person's worth, and that she had been wrong in a way that nearly cost her everything to learn. She told them that the poorest man she had ever met had turned out to be the richest in the ways that mattered most, a man who gave without expecting recognition, who forgave without demanding apology, who risked his own life without hesitation for someone who had shown him nothing but contempt. The room fell utterly silent as she spoke, many employees blinking back tears they had not expected to feel. And when she finally turned to look directly at Daniel, standing near the back of the room, she thanked him aloud, in front of everyone, for teaching her what no fortune ever could. The applause that followed was long and genuine, filling the same ballroom that had once echoed with careless laughter at Daniel's expense. And this time, every person in that room looked at him not with pity or disdain, but with unmistakable respect. Several employees who had witnessed his humiliation the year before found themselves quietly wiping their eyes, struck by how completely the story had turned, and how deserving the man at the center of it had always been of the honor now being paid to him. Among the crowd that evening stood the same security guards who had always greeted Daniel warmly. The flower vendor who had once saved him wilted bouquets, and the young janitor whose bus fare he had quietly covered for 2 months, without ever mentioning it again. Each of them had their own small story to tell about the man being honored that night. And in the days that followed, those stories spread through the company the way real character always eventually does, not through announcement, but through the steady testimony of people who had witnessed it firsthand. Emily made it a point afterward to ensure that kindness like Daniel's would never again go unnoticed inside the walls of a company that bore her family's name, establishing a quiet fund in his honor that recognized employees whose generosity was otherwise invisible to the people at the top. After the ceremony ended and the crowd slowly dispersed into the cold evening, Daniel asked Emily to walk with him one more time, leading her not toward the elegant restaurants nearby, but back to the quiet corner of the building where they had first crossed paths over a year earlier, the same spot where he had once knelt fixing a faulty circuit while she walked past and dismissed him without a second thought. Emily laughed softly at the memory as they stood there together, the irony of it settling gently between them, and Daniel reached into his jacket pocket with hands that trembled slightly, not from cold, but from something far more vulnerable. He knelt down in that same spot, the plain gold band still resting on his other hand, as a quiet tribute to the past he would never abandon, and asked Emily to marry him, his voice steady, even as his eyes shone with emotion. He no longer felt the need to hide. Emily's breath caught, tears spilling freely down her cheeks, as she nodded, before she could even find the words to answer aloud. Sinking to her knees beside him and wrapping her arms around the man who had once been invisible to her and had since become the very center of her world. Around them, a few remaining employees who had lingered nearby began to clap softly, witnesses to an ending that felt less like fiction and more like proof that the world still held room for stories like this one. As dusk settled over the city and the last golden leaves of autumn drifted down around them, Daniel and Emily walked together beneath the bare branches, lining the courtyard, no longer a billionaire heiress and an invisible maintenance man, but simply two people who had found each other through courage, humility, and a kindness that refused to keep score. The distance that had once seemed impossible to cross had closed entirely, not through wealth or status, but through the simple, enduring truth that a person's value was never measured by what they owned, but by what they were willing to give, sacrifice, and forgive for the sake of another. And somewhere in that quiet courtyard, beneath a sky finally clearing after a long season of storms, two lives that had once seemed worlds apart settled, at last, into the same steady rhythm of home.